There is a mansion on the American coastline that locals refuse to photograph after dark. Not because it's dangerous, though the rotting floors and collapsing ceilings certainly are. Not because it's abandoned, though it has been for decades, but because there is something about the way it looks in the fading light. Windows like hollow eyes, gardens choked with thorns, gates rusted shut as if the house itself is holding its breath. That makes people feel watched. They say the estate is alive, that it remembers, that it feeds on the tragedies that have unfolded within its walls for over 2 centuries. And at the center of its darkest chapter is a woman whose name once glittered across society pages and tabloid covers alike. Alexandra Kingsley, the heiress born into American aristocracy and destined to become the estate's final, most tragic prisoner. Before her inheritance, the Kingsley estate was already infamous. 118 rooms, imported stone from 3 continents, secret passageways that led to nowhere. Gardens designed to rival Versailles but left to decay into something closer to a graveyard. But the architecture was never the story. The story was the pattern. Because for over 250 years, every family who owned the land suffered the same fate: scandal, ruin, madness, or early death. The colonial merchant whose wife and children died under mysterious circumstances. The industrialist heir who fell from the highest tower, swearing the house pushed him. The socialite who vanished 3 months after marrying into the family. The Prohibition-era heir shot in the dining hall, under circumstances the police called accidental, but everyone else called impossible. Generation after generation, the estate devoured its owners. And still, no one could abandon it. Because this wasn't just a house, it was a legacy, a monument to old money power, a symbol of American aristocracy that refused to die even as everyone inside it did. When Alexandra inherited the estate at 32, she believed, truly believed, that she could be different, that she could restore it, reclaim it, rewrite the narrative that had haunted her family for centuries. She poured her fortune into renovations, her energy into preservation, her sanity into the desperate hope that the curse was just superstition, just folklore, just the invention of jealous outsiders who resented wealth they could never possess. But the house had other plans. Within 5 years, her money was gone, her reputation shattered, her mind unraveling in journals filled with frantic entries about whispers in empty hallways, footsteps that followed her through sealed wings, and mirrors that reflected things that shouldn't exist. By the time anyone realized how far she'd fallen, it was too late. The heiress who once graced magazine covers as the embodiment of glamorous old money became a ghost story herself, a cautionary tale about the price of legacy, the weight of inheritance, and the danger of loving something that doesn't love you back. Today, the Kingsley estate still stands. Barely, ivy consumes its walls, and roofs collapse room by room, priceless frescoes peel and fade. Police patrol the perimeter to keep urban explorers out, though hundreds still trespass every year, drawn by morbid fascination to America's most cursed estate. And somewhere in the ruins, carved into a beam in the grand ballroom where Alexandra was found barely conscious, are words she left behind: "The house is finished with me now." This is the story of how she got there. The story of a woman trapped between duty and destruction, between heritage and horror, between the life she was supposed to live and the nightmare the estate had waiting for her. This is the dark history of Alexandra Kingsley and the mansion that refused to let her go. Every curse has an origin, a moment when something shifts, when the land remembers violence, betrayal, or greed, and begins exacting payment from everyone who claims it. For the estate that would one day consume Alexandra Kingsley, that moment came long before her family ever set foot on the property. It came in 1761 when a colonial merchant named Samuel Heiress built the first grand home on the windswept cliffs overlooking the Atlantic. Heiress was a self-made man in an era when such things were rare. He'd arrived in America with nothing and clawed his way to wealth through shipping contracts, trade monopolies, and deals that historians would later describe as morally flexible. By the time he was 40, he owned more land than some European nobles, and he wanted the world to see it. So he commissioned a mansion, not the sprawling Gothic labyrinth that would come later, but something significant enough to announce his arrival among America's emerging elite. The house rose quickly. Local craftsmen were hired. Stone was imported. Gardens were planted. Within 2 years, the Harrow estate stood complete, a symbol of ambition realized. But ambition, Samuel Harrow would learn, always demands interest. The first tragedy struck in 1768. His wife, Margaret, died suddenly of what doctors call fever. No warning, no prolonged illness, just 3 days of delirium, speaking in languages she'd never learned, and then silence. Harrow buried her in the garden and returned to work. Then came the children. His eldest son, Thomas, vanished one autumn morning. Search parties combed the estate for weeks. They found nothing, not clothing, not footprints, not a single trace. It was as if the boy had simply ceased to exist. 6 months later, his daughter disappeared under identical circumstances. And then his youngest, a boy of 7, drowned in the estate's ornamental lake, in 2 feet of water, on a calm day, with no explanation for how a child who could swim ended up face down in water that shouldn't have been deep enough to drown in. The local newspaper, cautious in its wording, called it a streak of impossible misfortune. Samuel Harrow called it something else, though he never spoke the word aloud. He abandoned the estate in 1770, left it fully furnished, fully staffed, and never returned. Within a year, he was dead, cause of death listed as melancholy, though servants whispered he'd simply stopped eating, stopped speaking, stopped wanting to live. The estate sat empty for decades. Local children dared each other to approach it. Adults avoided it. Stories began circulating. Ghost sightings, strange lights. Voices echoing from windows that shouldn't have been open. But the land itself was valuable, profitable. And in America, profit eventually overpowers superstition. In 1887, Edward Kingsley, Alexandra's great-grandfather, purchased the property for a fraction of its worth. He was the kind of man who saw opportunity where others saw risk. The rumors about the estate didn't frighten him. If anything, they excited him. He believed he could erase the dark history with grandeur, with scale, with the kind of wealth that redefines reality. And so he built, not a renovation, not a restoration, a complete reconstruction. He demolished what remained of Samuel Harrow's original mansion and raised something far more ambitious in its place. 118 rooms, imported Italian marble, French ironwork, secret passageways designed for staff to move invisibly, gilded ceilings that rivaled European palaces, and gardens modeled after Versailles. It was meant to be a monument to American aristocracy, a declaration that the New World could match the old in elegance, power, and permanence. But from the beginning, strange things happened. Gardeners swore they heard children laughing in the hedge maze, children who vanished when approached. Overnight, staff refused to work alone. They claimed to hear footsteps in sealed wing, doors opening and closing in rooms that were locked, whispers in languages they didn't recognize. And then came the accident. A construction worker named Daniel Cross fell from the estate's highest tower during the final phase of construction. He survived long enough to speak to the foreman, and his final words were recorded in the incident report. "The house pushed me. It didn't want me there." Edward Kingsley dismissed it as delirium, paid the family, finished construction. The estate opened to great fanfare in 1894. Newspapers called it the Southern Versailles. Society columnists praised its opulence. The Kingsley family had arrived, but the tragedies never stopped. Edward's eldest son, the intended heir, died at 27. The official cause was listed as heart failure, but he'd been perfectly healthy the day before. No warning, no illness, just gone. His younger brother eloped with a famous socialite, a woman named Catherine Vale, who was known for her beauty and charm. 3 months after the wedding, she vanished. No note, no explanation. Her belongings remained in her room. It was as if she'd simply walked out of existence. Then came Prohibition. During a dinner party in 1926, another Kingsley heir, Jonathan, was shot in the estate's grand dining hall. The official report called it an accident, a dropped gun, a tragic misfire. But guests who were there whispered a different story. They said the gun was on a table across the room, that Jonathan had been standing alone when it discharged, that no one had touched it. Each tragedy deepened the estate's reputation. By the 1930s, it was no longer just a symbol of wealth. it had become something darker, a monument to misfortune, a place where old money and old ghosts coexisted in an uneasy, suffocating silence. Newspapers couldn't resist the story. The Kingsley estate became one of the first infamous estates in American culture, a Gothic landmark that attracted tourists, ghost hunters, and the morbidly curious. And into this legacy, in 1976, Alexandra Kingsley was born. She didn't choose the inheritance. She didn't ask for the burden of a family defined by tragedy and cursed architecture. But from the moment she took her first breath inside the estate's walls, the house had already decided her fate, because the pattern had been set centuries earlier, in the days of Samuel Harrow, when something on that land tasted blood and decided it would never stop feeding. And every generation since had been just another meal. Alexandra Kingsley didn't grow up in a home. She grew up in a museum, a mausoleum, a monument to everyone who had died before her. The estate's East Wing, where the family lived when they weren't hosting society functions or maintaining appearances, was filled with relics from generations past. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the hallways, their eyes seeming to follow visitors from room to room. Furniture covered in white sheets filled spaces no one had used in decades. An entire nursery remained perfectly preserved since 1892, as if the children who once slept there might return at any moment. There were locked rooms no one explained, hallways sealed after accidents no one discussed. Wings of the mansion Alexandra wasn't allowed to explore as a child, not because they were dangerous, but because, as her mother once said, some parts of the house need to be left alone. Her mother, Vivian Kingsley, was a woman obsessed with legacy in the what only old money can be. Not wealth. The Kingsleys had wealth. What Vivian cared about was reputation, the family name, the myth of unbroken lineage and aristocratic refinement. She raised Alexandra not with fairy tales, but with duty. "You are a Kingsley," she would say, standing in front of ancestral portraits as if addressing the dead as much as her daughter. "That means something. That must mean something. And when your time comes, you will restore what has been tarnished." Alexandra was 8 years old when her mother first told her about the curse, not as folklore, not as ghost stories meant to entertain, as fact. "Our family has been marked," Vivian said, her voice calm, almost clinical. "Every generation pays a price, but that doesn't mean we surrender. It means we endure. We prove ourselves stronger than history." It was a strange way to raise a child, between denial and acceptance, between pride and paranoia. Alexandra learned to walk the estate's halls with both reverence and fear, to love the house and distrust it in equal measure. By the time she was a teenager, she had begun keeping a journal. Not a diary of typical adolescent thoughts, but something darker. Observations, questions, an attempt to catalog the strangeness she felt but couldn't name. "Heard footsteps in the West Wing tonight. No one is staying there. Mother says the mirrors in the ballroom are original. I don't like looking at them. Sometimes it feels like they're looking back. Dreamed about the garden again, the same spot every time. Something buried there?" But as much as the house unsettled her, Alexandra couldn't imagine leaving it, because she had been raised to believe that leaving would be betrayal, that abandoning the estate meant abandoning her entire identity. So she stayed. And as she grew older, she became something the world outside found irresistible, the glamorous heiress of a cursed mansion. By the 1990s, Alexandra Kingsley was a fixture in society magazines and tabloids. She was beautiful in the way old money often is, elegant, poised, with a melancholy edge that made her seem both untouchable and tragic. Photographers loved her. Journalists couldn't resist the narrative. Headlines called her the last Kingsley. Features asked, can she break the curse? Television specials did segments on the estate's dark history, always ending with shots of Alexandra walking the grounds, looking ethereal and doomed. She played the role well, smiled for cameras, attended charity galas, gave carefully worded interviews that acknowledged the rumors without confirming them. But privately, she was terrified, because the house was changing. Or maybe she was just old enough to finally notice. Doors she remembered being locked were now open. Rooms she'd been forbidden to enter as a child now seemed to invite her. She would wake in the middle of the night to the sound of music, faint, distant, as if an orchestra were playing somewhere deep in the estate's sealed wings. She mentioned it once to her father, a detached man who had long ago retreated into his study and his whiskey. He looked at her for a long moment, then said simply, "Don't go looking for answers. The house doesn't give them." That was the only advice he ever offered. When Alexandra was 30, her mother died. Officially, it was a stroke, but there were whispers. Whispers that Vivian had been found in the garden at dawn, barefoot and disoriented, talking to no one. That she'd spent her final days wandering the estate's halls, searching for something she wouldn't name. Her father followed 2 years later. Heart attack, or so the doctor said. But Alexandra had been there. She'd heard him in the study the night before he died, speaking in a low, urgent voice. When she opened the door, he was alone. No phone, no one else in the room, just her father, looking at the corner by the fireplace, saying over and over, I know, I'm sorry." At 32, Alexandra inherited everything: the estate, the fortune, the name, the curse. And the moment the inheritance became official, everything began to unravel. The first blow came from the lawyers. The estate owed over $40 million in back taxes and deferred maintenance costs. Her parents, obsessed with appearances, had been quietly liquidating assets for years to keep up the illusion of wealth. The fortune that was supposed to last generations was already gone. But Alexandra refused to accept it, because selling the estate, admitting defeat, felt like erasing her entire family, like proving that the curse had won. So she made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would restore the house, finish what her ancestors started, prove that a Kingsley could survive. She poured every remaining dollar into renovations, hired contractors, fired longtime staff who knew too much about the family's decline, began living alone in the West Wing, the rest of the mansion too expensive to heat or maintain. And the house, sensing her desperation, began to feed. She started keeping a new journal. The entries grew darker. I hear them now, every night, voices in the walls. Someone is moving furniture in the sealed rooms. I checked this morning. Everything is exactly where it was, but I heard it. The mirrors, I can't look at them anymore. I see things, shapes behind me, faces I don't recognize. It wants me here. The house wants me to stay. Friends who visited grew concerned. They said Alexandra looked exhausted, paranoid, obsessed, that she barely ate, barely slept, spent all her time wandering the estate at night with a flashlight, checking locks, listening at doors. One friend, Emily, begged her to leave. "Alex, you're destroying yourself. Sell it. Walk away. You don't owe this place your life." Alexandra looked at her with hollow eyes. "If I leave," she said quietly, "I'll die anyway. The house won't let me go." Emily never came back, and Alexandra descended deeper into the mansion's embrace, convinced that survival meant submission, that the only way to break the curse was to become part of it. She didn't realize she was already lost. By 2008, Alexandra had spent nearly everything trying to save the estate. Loans defaulted one after another. Priceless art pieces that had hung in the halls for generations were quietly sold at auction. Family heirlooms, jewelry, furniture, even her grandmother's collection of European porcelain went under the hammer in a contested sale that shocked the old money world. Property taxes fell dangerously behind, accumulating into a debt that would take millions to clear. But through it all, she still insisted the house needed her. The financial collapse was only the beginning. What happened next would transform Alexandra from a struggling heiress into something far more unsettling. A woman the public couldn't look away from, even as they watched her unravel. Workers hired for restoration began leaving abruptly, and their reasons were always the same. One contractor claimed he saw Alexandra speaking to someone in an empty hallway, having what appeared to be an intense conversation with thin air. When he approached to check if she was all right, she turned to him with a blank expression and asked, "Didn't you see him standing right there?" There was no one. Another worker refused to enter the library after his third day on the job. He described hearing someone breathing directly behind him while he worked alone in the room. The sound was close enough that he could feel warmth on the back of his neck. When he spun around, the room was empty. He packed his tools and left that afternoon, never returning to collect his final paycheck. Several workers described cold spots that seemed to move through rooms, following them as they worked. Lights flickered in patterns that made no electrical sense. And most disturbing of all, furniture appeared to shift positions between work shifts. A desk that stood against the east wall at 5 p.m. would be found against the west wall at 8 a.m., with no evidence anyone had moved it. No drag marks, no disturbance in the dust. The local newspapers, which had been relatively quiet about the estate for years, suddenly reignited their coverage. "The Kingsley curse returns," read one headline. "Workers flee haunted mansion," read another. Old stories were republished. New interviews with former staff members appeared weekly. The estate and Alexandra were once again front-page news. But this time, the coverage was darker, less sympathetic. The public fascination had shifted from admiration to morbid curiosity. As her fortune collapsed, so did her grip on reality. Alexandra retreated deeper into the mansion, abandoning most of its 118 rooms. She lived in only 3, a bedroom, a small sitting room, and what had once been her father's study. She boarded up windows, claiming the sunlight disturbed the house. She stopped answering phone calls, stopped responding to letters, stopped appearing in public entirely. Her journals from this period reveal a mind in freefall. Early entries are methodical, almost businesslike. Lists of repairs needed, budgets, contractors to call. But as the months pass, the entries become fragmented. Paranoid, obsessive. "The house wants me here," she wrote in March of 2009. "It won't let me leave," she wrote 3 weeks later. "They all died because they tried to escape. I won't make that mistake. I'll stay. I'll finish what they started. Then it will release me." Neighbors began reporting strange sightings. Alexandra walking the grounds late at night, dressed in a nightgown, carrying an old oil lantern, even though the estate still had electricity. She would move slowly through the overgrown gardens, stopping occasionally to speak to the darkness. Sometimes she would stand perfectly still for minutes at a time, staring up at the mansion's highest tower. One neighbor, emboldened by concern, approached her during one of these nighttime walks. Alexandra looked at her with hollow eyes and said only, "They're waiting for me inside. I can't keep them waiting." Then she turned and walked back into the house. The final breaking point came when drone footage of the estate leaked online. An urban explorer had flown a camera over the property, capturing the full extent of its decay. Sections of the roof had collapsed. Windows were shattered. Ivy had consumed entire wings. The once pristine gardens looked like a jungle. But the most chilling part of the footage was a figure visible in one of the upper windows, a woman in white, standing perfectly still, staring directly at the camera. The video went viral within hours. A post titled "The Heiress Who Won't Leave Her Haunted Palace" spread across every social media platform. Millions of people watched. Thousands commented. Conspiracy theories exploded overnight. Some claimed she was already dead and the figure in the window was her ghost. Others insisted she was performing some kind of ritual to awaken whatever lived in the house. A few believed she had gone completely insane and was now a danger to herself. The scrutiny became unbearable. A Vanity Fair profile published shortly after described her as a ghost of old money, haunting the ruins of a dynasty that should have ended generations ago. The article was beautifully written and devastatingly cruel, painting Alexandra as a cautionary tale about inherited wealth and the dangers of clinging to the past. Rumors spread that she had deliberately run through her inheritance, that she wanted to destroy the estate and herself along with it. Some claimed she had made a deal with dark forces. Others whispered that the house had finally claimed her, just as it had claimed everyone before her. A viral documentary released on YouTube titled "The Kingsley Curse, America's Most Haunted Fortune" accused her of romanticizing a haunted ruin and exploiting tragedy for attention. The documentary featured interviews with distant relatives, former staff members, and paranormal investigators. None of them had spoken to Alexandra in years, but that didn't stop them from speculating about her mental state, her intentions, and her future. The pressure, the scrutiny, the isolation, it all pushed her over the edge. By the winter of 2010, Alexandra Kingsley had become exactly what the estate had always produced: another victim, another tragedy, another name added to the long list of people destroyed by the curse. And the house, indifferent to her suffering, continued to decay around her. One winter morning in late January, a groundskeeper arrived at the estate for his usual rounds. He had been hired by the county to maintain the perimeter and ensure no trespassers entered the property. It was a simple job. He rarely saw anyone, and he certainly never entered the house itself. But that morning, something was different. The gates were wide open. For the first time in decades, the massive iron gates stood fully ajar, as if inviting someone inside. The groundskeeper hesitated, then called the local police. 2 officers arrived within 20 minutes, and together they walked through the snow-covered grounds toward the mansion's entrance. The front doors were also open. Inside, the air was freezing, colder than the temperature outside. Their breath formed clouds as they moved cautiously through the entrance hall, calling out Alexandra's name. No response. They moved deeper into the house, through corridors lined with rotting portraits and furniture covered in dust. They found her in the grand ballroom. Alexandra lay on the floor beneath the massive crystal chandelier, her body curled in a fetal position. She was alive, but barely. Her skin was pale, almost translucent. Her breathing was shallow. She looked like she hadn't eaten in weeks. The paramedics who arrived shortly after described her condition as severe dehydration and malnutrition. She was rushed to the hospital, where doctors worked to stabilize her. She spent 3 days in intensive care before finally regaining consciousness. But when she woke, she wouldn't speak about the estate, wouldn't even acknowledge its existence. The only thing she left behind was a single piece of paper torn from one of her journals, found on the ballroom floor beside her. It read, "The house is finished with me now." Alexandra spent her final years in a private care facility on the outskirts of the city. She lived quietly, away from the public eye under a name that wasn't her own. She refused interviews, declined book deals, ignored every attempt by journalists, filmmakers, and historians to document her story. To the few staff members who interacted with her, she seemed at peace, distant but peaceful, as if she had finally been released from something that had held her captive for her entire life. She never spoke about the estate again. Not once. Alexandra Kingsley died in November of 2019. The cause of death was listed as natural causes. She was 73 years old. Her obituary was brief, published in only a handful of newspapers. It made no mention of the estate, the curse, or the tragedies that had defined her family for generations. She was buried in a small cemetery far from the estate, under a simple headstone that bore only her name and dates. No epitaph, no mention of her lineage, no acknowledgement of the Kingsley dynasty. It was as if she had wanted to disappear completely. But the estate refused to disappear. Today, the Kingsley estate sits abandoned, a crumbling monument to a family that no longer exists. Ivy has swallowed entire sections of the exterior walls. The roof has collapsed in multiple places, exposing the interior to rain and snow. Priceless frescoes that once decorated the ceilings are now streaked with water damage and mold. Windows are shattered. Doors hang off their hinges. The local government has sealed the property. Heavy chains lock the gates. No trespassing signs are posted every few feet along the perimeter. Police patrol the area regularly to keep out urban explorers, ghost hunters, and curiosity seekers. But it doesn't stop them. Every year, thousands of people attempt to enter the estate. Some climb the walls. Others cut through fences. A few have even tried to bribe security guards. They come with cameras, recording equipment, and dreams of capturing evidence of the supernatural. They come because the Kingsley estate has become something more than a house. It has become a legend, and legends never truly die. The question of Alexandra's legacy is a complicated one. Historians, folklorists, psychologists, and paranormal researchers all have different interpretations of her story, and each reveals something different about how we process tragedy, wealth, and the past. Historians tend to frame the story as a metaphor. To them, Alexandra represents the inevitable collapse of old money, fortunes built on exploitation, maintained through exclusion, and ultimately crushed under their own weight. The estate, in this interpretation, is not cursed by supernatural forces, but by the moral debts of generations. Every tragedy that occurred there was simply the consequence of a system designed to concentrate power and wealth in the hands of a few. Alexandra's downfall, then, was not the result of ghosts or curses, but of trying to preserve something that was always meant to collapse. Folklorists see the story differently. To them, the Kingsley estate is a genuine haunting, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead has worn thin. They point to the consistent reports of paranormal activity spanning centuries, the strange deaths, the inexplicable events. In their interpretation, the house itself is a kind of entity feeding on the obsession and fear of its inhabitants. Alexandra was not a victim of economic forces, but of something far older and far more malicious. She was consumed just like everyone before her. Psychologists offer a third perspective. They see Alexandra as a woman suffering from severe trauma, isolation, and mental illness. Raised in an environment steeped in tragedy and superstition, surrounded by a public that treated her like a character in a story rather than a real person, she internalized the myth of the curse. Her descent into paranoia and obsession, they argue, was not caused by supernatural forces, but by the crushing weight of expectation, grief, and loneliness. The house was not haunted, Alexandra was. But to those who knew her personally, the explanation is simpler and sadder. Alexandra inherited a legacy no one could survive. She was born into a story that had already been written, and no matter what choices she made, the ending was always going to be the same. The estate demanded everything from her, her money, her sanity, her life, and she gave it willingly because she believed it was her duty. The tragedy of Alexandra Kingsley is that she never had a chance. So why does this story endure? Why years after her death, do people still talk about the Kingsley estate, still make pilgrimages to its gates, still create documentaries and write articles and tell ghost stories about the heiress who couldn't escape? Because the story contains everything that captivates us. It has wealth and power, the kind of extreme generational fortune most people will never experience. It has mystery and the supernatural, events that defy rational explanation. It has a compelling protagonist, a woman trapped between the past and the present, between duty and self-preservation. And it has a mansion that refuses to release its secrets, a structure that seems to exist outside of time, waiting for the next person foolish enough to claim it. The Kingsley estate stands as a monument to ambition, obsession, and the weight of legacy. It reminds us that some inheritances are not blessings, but curses, that some stories do not have happy endings, that some places are better left abandoned. And yet, despite everything, people still cannot look away. Late at night, when fog rolls through the valley and settles around the estate's crumbling walls, locals say you can still see lights flickering in the upper windows. Some say it's just reflections, moonlight on broken glass. Others insist it's something more. They say that if you stand at the gates long enough,